History loves to crown kings with gold. But what happens when a king becomes so wealthy that he literally breaks the global economy? What happens when one man's generosity creates an international crisis that lasts for decades? This is the story of Mansa Musa, a West African emperor who controlled more gold than the rest of the world combined, yet remained virtually unknown to most of human history. A devout Muslim who built mosques with his bare hands, but also commanded an empire built on the backs of enslaved peoples. A man so generous that his charity tour to Mecca accidentally caused a recession across 3 continents. Wait, what? Yes, you heard that right. In 1324, one man's pilgrimage was so extravagant, so impossibly wealthy, that it destabilized the entire Mediterranean economy for 12 years. We're talking about a depression caused not by war or famine, but by too much gold flooding the market at once. How does a ruler from the supposed dark continent, as European maps dismissively labeled Africa, amass a fortune that would make modern billionaires weep with envy? How does a man who never learned to read or write create a trade network so sophisticated that it connects sub-Saharan Africa to medieval Europe, the Middle East, and Asia? This isn't just about wealth. This is about power. The kind of power that reshapes continents, redirects global trade routes, and forces the medieval world to acknowledge that civilization's heart wasn't beating in Paris or Constantinople, but in the golden cities of West Africa. Picture the world in 1312. Europe is crawling out of the Dark Ages, still reeling from the Crusades. The Black Death hasn't arrived yet, but feudalism grips the continent in poverty and ignorance. Most European kings struggle to maintain their castles, while their subjects starve. Meanwhile, in the heart of West Africa, along the bend of the Niger River, lies an empire that European cartographers can barely comprehend. The Mali Empire stretches from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger, larger than Western Europe itself. This isn't the Africa of European imagination, filled with primitive tribes and untamed wilderness. This is a sophisticated civilization with libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, universities that attract scholars from across the Islamic world, and cities that gleam with architectural marvels. At the center of it all sits Niani, Mali's capital, where the thunder of war drums mingles with the chanting of Islamic prayers, where caravans loaded with gold dust arrive daily, and where a young prince named Musa is about to inherit the most profitable trade monopoly in human history. But here's the thing about inheriting ultimate power. It's never that simple. In 1312, Emperor Abu Bakr II makes a decision that will change the course of world history. Obsessed with exploring the Atlantic Ocean, convinced that land exists beyond the western waters, he abdons his throne to lead a fleet of 2,000 vessels into the unknown. He's never seen again. That's when Musa, his deputy and cousin, faces a choice that will define not just his reign, but the economic fate of 3 continents. Does he maintain the quiet, steady rule that has made Mali prosperous, but unknown to the outside world? Or does he seize this moment to announce Mali's presence on the global stage in the most spectacular way imaginable? What happens next will make European merchants rewrite their maps, force Egyptian rulers to beg for economic mercy, and create legends that persist for 7 centuries. But first, we need to understand how a landlocked African empire became the financial puppet master of the medieval world. This is the story of the greatest fortune in human history, and the man who almost destroyed the global economy by being too generous. Mansa Musa wasn't born to rule. In the complex succession system of the Mali Empire, power passed through the maternal line, and Musa was originally intended to serve as deputy, the trusted administrator who would handle day-to-day governance, while the emperor focused on military campaigns and diplomatic missions. But sometimes history has other plans. The Mali Empire that Musa Inherited in 1312 was already an economic powerhouse, but its wealth came from controlling something more precious than gold itself: information. You see, in the medieval world, knowing where to find gold was infinitely more valuable than owning gold. And Mali controlled the ultimate secret: the location of the Bambuk and Bure gold fields, the most productive gold mines on Earth. Picture this. You're a North African merchant in 1310, desperate to secure gold for trade with European kingdoms. You journey south across the Sahara, enduring months of brutal heat, sandstorms that can bury entire caravans, and the constant threat of desert nomads. Finally, you reach the trading cities of Mali, Timbuktu, Gao, Jenny. You're exhausted, broke, and completely dependent on Malian hospitality. But here's the catch: you will never, ever see where the gold comes from. Malian law was absolute on this point. Foreign merchants could trade in the northern cities, but they were forbidden from traveling south to the goldfields. The actual mining operations remained a state secret, protected by both law and the natural barrier of the river systems that foreign traders couldn't navigate. This wasn't just protectionism. This was economic genius. By controlling access to the source, Mali could manipulate gold prices across the known world. When European demand increased, Mali could restrict supply. When North African kingdoms grew too powerful, Mali could flood the market and crash their economies. But gold was only half of Mali's secret. The other half was salt. While Europe struggled with preserving food and the Middle East traded in spices, Mali controlled the Saharan salt mines at Taghaza, vast underground deposits of pure salt that stretched for miles beneath the desert. To understand why this mattered, imagine living in a world without refrigeration, where salt was the only way to preserve meat, where salt was literally as valuable as silver. Mali didn't just control gold mines and salt mines. They controlled the trade route between them. Picture the genius of this setup. Northern kingdoms desperate for gold had to pay with salt, among other goods, which Mali then traded south to kingdoms that desperately needed salt preservation but had plenty of gold. Mali became the middleman for both commodities, taking a cut from every transaction while never revealing the locations of their sources. When Musa took power in 1312, he inherited this system, but he also inherited its greatest vulnerability. Secrecy only works as long as you remain hidden. Musa's first major challenge came not from foreign invasion, but from within. The Soso people, traditional enemies of Mali, who had been conquered but never fully integrated, saw the transition of power as an opportunity for rebellion. Led by a chieftain named Sumangaru's heir, they launched coordinated attacks on Mali's southern provinces, directly threatening the gold-producing regions. This was Musa's moment of truth. A weak response would signal to other vassal states that the new emperor could be challenged. A brutal response would destabilize the delicate balance of cooperation and coercion that kept the empire functioning. But Musa chose a third option, one that revealed the strategic brilliance that would define his reign. Instead of simply crushing the rebellion militarily, Musa cut off the rebels' access to salt. Within months, their food preservation collapsed, their population faced starvation, and their military effectiveness evaporated. But here's the masterful part. When the rebels finally surrendered, Musa didn't execute their leaders or seize their lands. Instead, he offered them full integration into the Mali trade network, including access to both salt and gold markets, in exchange for loyalty and military service. Within a year, the former rebels became some of Mali's most effective generals. Musa had learned the lesson that would define his reign. Power through prosperity was more durable than power through punishment. By 1320, 8 years into his reign, Musa had expanded Mali's territory to its greatest extent, from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger River, encompassing parts of present-day Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea. and Ivory Coast. His empire was larger than Western Europe, with a population approaching 8 million people. But size wasn't Musa's obsession. Integration was. Unlike European kingdoms that extracted wealth from conquered territories, Mali developed them. Musa established schools, built infrastructure, and created administrative systems that allowed local customs to coexist with imperial oversight. The empire became a patchwork of cultures, languages, and traditions held together not by force, but by the promise of shared prosperity. This is when Musa began to envision something unprecedented, a pilgrimage to Mecca that would announce Mali's arrival on the world stage. Islamic law required every Muslim who could afford it to make the Hajj once in their lifetime. For most believers, this meant scraping together enough money for basic survival during the journey. But Musa wasn't most believers. He began planning a pilgrimage that would be part religious devotion, part economic diplomacy, and part psychological warfare. He would travel to Mecca in such magnificent style that the entire Islamic world would be forced to acknowledge Mali as a major power. He would be so generous, so overwhelmingly wealthy, that kingdoms along his route would remember Mali forever. What he didn't anticipate was that his generosity would be so overwhelming that it would crash the economy of half the known world. In 1324, Mansa Musa departed Mali for Mecca with an entourage so magnificent that chroniclers still struggle to describe it accurately. Picture this: a procession stretching for miles across the desert. 60,000 people, including soldiers, merchants, scholars, and servants. 500 slaves, each carrying a staff of pure gold weighing 6 pounds. 80 camels, each carrying between 50 and 300 pounds of gold dust. A personal cavalry of horsemen in silk robes, their weapons decorated with gold inlay. But the most staggering element wasn't the display. It was the logistics. Feeding and supplying 60,000 people during a journey of thousands of miles required organizational capabilities that most medieval kingdoms couldn't match. Musa had essentially mobilized a small nation and moved it across 2 continents. The first stop was Cairo, the jewel of the Mamluk Sultanate, and one of the wealthiest cities in the Islamic world. The Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Hassan had seen plenty of wealthy pilgrims, but nothing had prepared him for Musa's arrival. Contemporary Egyptian chronicler al-Umari, writing 12 years after the event, recorded what happened. This man flooded Cairo with his kindness. He left no court official nor holder of a royal office without the gift of a load of gold. The people of Cairo made incalculable profits out of him and his suite. But here's where the story gets economically fascinating and historically catastrophic. Musa didn't just give gifts. He distributed so much gold in Cairo that he single-handedly triggered massive inflation. Within weeks, gold prices in Cairo collapsed. The precious metal that had been carefully regulated by Egyptian authorities became so common that its value plummeted below silver. What you have to understand is that medieval economies were delicate ecosystems. Currency values were based on scarcity, trade was built on predictable exchange rates, and international commerce depended on stable relationships between gold, silver, and copper. Musa had just thrown a financial grenade into the heart of Mediterranean trade. Egyptian merchants who had stockpiled gold found themselves ruined overnight. International traders who had negotiated contracts based on previous gold values found their agreements worthless. The economic chaos rippled outward from Cairo like shock waves from an earthquake. As Musa's caravan continued eastward through the Middle East, the economic disruption spread. In Damascus, gold markets collapsed before he even arrived. Merchants had heard the stories from Cairo and began panic selling their gold reserves. In Baghdad, currency exchange houses closed rather than try to calculate fair rates in a market where gold's value changed daily. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Musa had no idea what he was doing to the global economy. From his perspective, he was simply being appropriately generous to fellow Muslims during his religious pilgrimage. The concept that his wealth could destabilize international commerce never occurred to him because no individual in human history had ever possessed enough wealth to accidentally break the world economy. Think about the scale we're discussing. Modern economists estimate that Musa was distributing gold worth approximately $400 billion in today's currency during his pilgrimage. But unlike modern billionaires whose wealth is tied up in stocks, real estate, and complex financial instruments, Musa's wealth was liquid, pure gold and salt that he could distribute immediately. The psychological impact was as devastating as the economic impact. Medieval worldviews depended on understanding where wealth and power originated. European kings derived authority from divine right and hereditary bloodlines. Middle Eastern sultans justified their rule through military conquest and Islamic law. But how do you process a sub-Saharan African emperor who possesses more liquid wealth than the rest of the known world combined? While economists and merchants grappled with the financial chaos, Islamic scholars faced their own revolution. Musa's entourage included some of the finest intellectuals from Mali's universities, particularly from Timbuktu's Sankore University. These scholars carried manuscripts, engaged in theological debates, and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Islamic jurisprudence that shattered European and Middle Eastern assumptions about African civilization. You have to remember that in 1324, most of the Islamic world viewed sub-Saharan Africa as a source of gold, slaves, and exotic animals, not sophisticated theology and mathematical innovation. But Musa's scholars were discussing algebraic concepts that wouldn't reach Europe for another century, debating philosophical questions that challenged established Islamic doctrine, and carrying geographical knowledge about trade routes that could revolutionize commerce. One of the most significant moments occurred in Mecca itself, during the Hajj ceremonies. Islamic law required all pilgrims, regardless of their worldly status, to wear simple white robes and perform identical rituals. Kings and peasants were supposed to be equal before Allah. But when Musa distributed enough gold to build mosques in every holy city, the theological implications became staggering. Was it possible for someone to be too generous? Could excessive charity become a form of pride? Islamic scholars spent decades debating the theological implications of Musa's pilgrimage, and their discussions influenced Islamic economic theory for centuries. By the time Musa began his return journey to Mali in 1325, the economic chaos he had created had become so severe that Egyptian authorities took unprecedented action. They begged him to stop giving away gold. Let that sink in for a moment. The rulers of one of the wealthiest nations on earth were pleading with a foreign king to please stop being so generous because his charity was destroying their economy. But here's where Musa demonstrated the financial sophistication that had built his empire. Recognizing the crisis he had inadvertently created, he began borrowing gold from Egyptian merchants at extremely high interest rates. This move served dual purposes. It removed some of the excess gold from circulation, helping to stabilize prices, while simultaneously demonstrating that Mali's wealth was so vast that Musa could afford to pay crushing interest rates without concern. The Egyptian chronicler Al-Umari noted, "He borrowed at a high rate of interest so much that he was able to deflate what he had inflated." But his generosity had already made its mark. Think about the economic genius of this move. Musa had recognized that he had caused a monetary crisis, devised a solution that would partially repair the damage, and implemented it in a way that actually enhanced his reputation for wealth rather than diminishing it. Egyptian merchants went from ruined to amazed. Here was a man so rich that he could afford to pay ridiculous interest rates as a favor to their economy, while Middle Eastern kingdoms struggled to understand the economic implications of Musa's pilgrimage. European cartographers faced a different challenge. How do you map a place that clearly exists, but that your entire worldview insists shouldn't? Medieval European maps had depicted Africa south of the Sahara as largely empty, populated by mythical creatures and primitive tribes. The existence of a sophisticated empire controlling vast wealth challenged fundamental assumptions about civilization, religion, and racial hierarchy that underpinned European society. The 1375 Catalan Atlas, created 50 years after Musa's pilgrimage, shows the revolution in European understanding. For the first time, a European map depicts an African ruler, Mansa Musa, sitting on a throne holding a golden orb with the inscription, "This Negro Lord is called Mansa Musa, Lord of the Negroes of Guinea. So abundant is the gold which is found in his country, that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land." But here's what's fascinating about the European response. They couldn't decide whether to be impressed or terrified. Musa's wealth proved that Africa possessed sophisticated civilizations, but it also meant that European assumptions about cultural and racial superiority were demonstrably false. Some European scholars began studying Arabic texts about Mali, while others doubled down on existing prejudices, insisting that Musa's wealth was somehow illegitimate or temporary. Returning to Mali in 1326, Musa found that his pilgrimage had achieved something beyond his wildest expectations. Trade delegations from across the Islamic world were arriving in Timbuktu, seeking to establish commercial relationships with the empire that had demonstrated such incredible wealth. But more importantly, Mali was now connected to global trade networks that extended from Spain to India. Musa capitalized on this opportunity by revolutionizing Mali's commercial infrastructure. He established permanent diplomatic missions in Cairo and Damascus, created standardized weights and measures that facilitated international trade, and, most significantly, began minting Mali's own currency, gold coins that bore Arabic inscriptions and Islamic designs, but were clearly identified as products of West African civilization. The psychological impact of Mali currency cannot be overstated. For the first time, a sub-Saharan African nation was producing money that was accepted from the Atlantic coast to the Indian Ocean. European merchants who had never heard of Mali found themselves using Malian gold coins in transactions across the Mediterranean, but with great power comes great responsibility. And Musa was about to discover that his newfound global prominence came with complications he hadn't anticipated. By 1330, Mali's success had attracted unwanted attention. North African kingdoms that had previously ignored Mali began viewing the empire as a threat to their own trade monopolies. European merchants started organizing expeditions to find direct routes to Mali's gold sources, bypassing traditional Middle Eastern intermediaries. Most dangerously, other West African kingdoms began, forming alliances to challenge Mali's commercial dominance. Musa responded to these challenges with the same combination of generosity and strategic brilliance that had defined his reign. Rather than trying to maintain secrecy about Mali's wealth, he embraced transparency about everything except the specific locations of gold and salt sources. He invited foreign merchants to Mali's cities, allowed them to witness the empire's prosperity, but continued to strictly control access to the actual production sites. This strategy had a brilliant psychological effect. Foreign visitors returned home with stories of Mali's magnificent cities, sophisticated administration, and incredible wealth. But they couldn't provide their own kingdoms with actionable intelligence about how to directly access Mali's resources. The empire became simultaneously famous and mysterious, admired and untouchable. By 1335, 23 years into his reign, Mansa Musa controlled an empire that generated more wealth than most European kingdoms combined. His pilgrimage had established Mali as a recognized power on the global stage. His trade networks stretched across 3 continents. His cities rivaled anything in the Islamic world for sophistication and learning. But success created a fundamental contradiction that threatened everything he had built. You see, Mali's wealth depended on controlling information, keeping the locations of gold mines secret, maintaining monopolies on trade routes, and preserving the delicate balance between supply and demand that kept gold prices high. But Mali's global prominence required openness, diplomatic relations with foreign powers, cultural exchange with Islamic scholars, and commercial relationships with international merchants. How do you remain simultaneously secretive and transparent? How do you maintain trade monopolies while engaging in open diplomatic relations? How do you keep your most valuable secrets while building trust with international partners? Musa's solution was characteristically brilliant and ultimately tragic. He decided to create two versions of Mali: the public empire that foreign visitors saw, and the hidden empire that actually produced the wealth. The public Mali was everything that foreign visitors expected. Magnificent cities like Timbuktu became showcases of wealth and learning, filled with libraries, universities, and architectural marvels that demonstrated the empire's sophistication. Foreign merchants were welcomed with elaborate hospitality, allowed to witness impressive displays of wealth, and encouraged to spread stories about Mali's prosperity throughout the known world. But the real Mali, the network of mining operations, administrative systems, and production facilities that generated the empire's wealth, remained hidden. Musa created an elaborate system of misdirection, where foreign visitors saw the results of Mali's wealth but never witnessed its sources. This double system worked brilliantly for foreign relations, but it created devastating internal problems. Mali's citizens began to feel like props in an elaborate performance designed to impress outsiders. Local communities that had been integrated into the empire through shared prosperity found themselves excluded from the most visible symbols of success. The empire that Musa had built through inclusion and cooperation was becoming divided between those who participated in the public spectacle and those who remained hidden in the productive interior. The contradictions, inherent in Mali's dual nature, became most apparent when Musa began planning for succession. In traditional Malian culture, leadership passed through maternal lines and was confirmed through community consensus. But Mali was no longer a traditional African kingdom. It was a global power whose rulers needed to maintain diplomatic relationships with foreign nations, understand international commerce, and navigate the complex politics of the Islamic world. Musa's designated successor, his son Mansa Musa, had been educated in Islamic law and Middle Eastern diplomacy, but he lacked deep understanding of the traditional African systems that maintained loyalty in Mali's interior provinces. Conversely, traditional leaders who understood local customs and cultural practices were unprepared for the complexities of international relations. The empire that had been united through shared prosperity was beginning to fragment along cultural lines. Islamic scholars in Timbuktu increasingly identified with Middle Eastern intellectual traditions rather than local African customs. Merchants in trading cities developed commercial relationships that bypassed traditional community structures. Even the military, which had been integrated through Musa's policy of incorporating former enemies, began dividing along ethnic and regional lines. Perhaps most dangerously, Mali had become economically dependent on maintaining its international reputation for wealth. The empire's trade relationships depended on foreign confidence in Mali's commercial reliability. Diplomatic alliances were built on the assumption that Mali could always offer valuable considerations in negotiations. The entire system required continuous demonstration of prosperity and power. But empires cannot expand indefinitely, and resources are never limitless. By 1340, Mali was approaching the geographic and logistical limits of sustainable expansion. The costs of maintaining the infrastructure necessary for international trade were becoming enormous. The administrative complexity of governing an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Niger Bend was straining even Mali's sophisticated bureaucratic systems. Most critically, the gold mines that had funded Mali's rise were showing signs of depletion. Not immediate crisis, The mines would continue producing for decades, but the endless expansion that had characterized Musa's reign was no longer possible. In 1337, facing these mounting pressures, Musa made the most controversial decision of his reign. Rather than acknowledging Mali's limitations and transitioning to a more sustainable model of governance, he decided to double down on the empire's reputation for limitless wealth. Musa announced plans for a second pilgrimage to Mecca, one that would be even more magnificent than his first journey. He began accumulating gold reserves, organizing an even larger entourage, and planning displays of wealth that would permanently establish Mali as the richest nation on earth. But this decision revealed the fundamental trap that his success had created. Mali's international reputation now depended on exceeding previous displays of wealth. Foreign kingdoms expected each interaction with Mali to be more impressive than the last. The empire had become trapped in an endless cycle of escalation, where maintaining international respect required increasingly dramatic demonstrations of prosperity. The second pilgrimage never happened. In 1337, at the height of his power and wealth, Mansa Musa died suddenly, leaving behind an empire that had become too large to manage, too complex to understand, and too dependent on his personal charisma to survive his absence. When news of Mansa Musa's death reached the courts of Cairo and Damascus in 1337, the immediate response was panic. European and Middle Eastern merchants who had built their commercial strategies around access to Mali's gold markets feared economic chaos. Islamic scholars who had established relationships with Mali's universities worried about losing access to African intellectual traditions. Diplomats who had negotiated treaties with Musa suddenly found themselves dealing with an unknown successor leading an empire in transition. But the real crisis was internal. Mansa Musa inherited an empire that was simultaneously at the peak of its wealth and on the verge of structural collapse. The dual system that Musa had created, public magnificence masking hidden vulnerabilities, made it impossible for anyone, including his successor, to fully understand Mali's actual strengths and weaknesses. Within 5 years of Musa's death, the empire began fragmenting. Vassal states that had remained loyal out of personal respect for Musa started asserting independence. Trade networks that had been maintained through Musa's personal relationships with foreign merchants began deteriorating. Most devastating of all, the careful balance between transparency and secrecy that had protected Mali's commercial advantages collapsed, allowing foreign powers to finally gain direct access to West African gold sources. Here's what makes Mansa Musa's story historically unique. He created the first truly global economic crisis caused by excessive prosperity. The gold market disruptions that began with his 1324 pilgrimage continued rippling through Mediterranean and Middle Eastern economies for over a decade, fundamentally altering international trade relationships and currency values. But more significantly, Musa proved that economic power could transcend traditional categories of political authority. He demonstrated that a landlocked African empire could exercise influence over European kingdoms, Middle Eastern sultanates, and Asian trading networks simply by controlling access to valuable resources and information. Modern economists studying medieval trade patterns can still trace the impact of Malay's commercial policies on global markets. The standardized weights and measures that Musa introduced influenced trading practices across the Islamic world. The diplomatic protocols he established for international commerce became models for later African kingdoms. Even the architectural styles he sponsored in Timbuktu influenced building designs from Morocco to Indonesia. Evaluating Musa's legacy requires grappling with profound moral contradictions that resist simple judgments. He created unprecedented prosperity for millions of Africans, established educational institutions that preserved human knowledge for centuries, and demonstrated that African civilizations could compete with any society on Earth for sophistication and achievement. Yet his empire was built on the labor of enslaved peoples, maintained through military conquest of neighboring societies, and designed to extract maximum wealth from controlled populations. His international reputation for generosity coexisted with domestic policies that concentrated power and wealth in the hands of a small elite. Perhaps most troubling from a modern perspective, Musa's success inadvertently contributed to the European exploration and exploitation of Africa. By demonstrating Africa's wealth to European merchants, his pilgrimage helped motivate the Portuguese expeditions that eventually led to the Atlantic slave trade. The very achievements that made Mali internationally prominent also made Africa a target for foreign exploitation. But here's what we cannot ignore. Musa governed during a time when slavery, conquest, and authoritarian rule were universal practices among world powers. Judged against medieval standards rather than modern values, Mali was remarkably progressive in its treatment of conquered peoples, its support for education and learning, and its policies of cultural inclusion. What can Mansa Musa's story teach us about our contemporary world? Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates that economic power without sustainable political institutions creates inherently unstable systems. Mali's wealth could purchase international respect and temporary influence, but it couldn't create the institutional durability necessary for long-term survival. Musa's reign also illustrates the dangers of depending on single resources or individuals for national success. Mali's economy was ultimately too dependent on gold production and too reliant on Musa's personal charisma. When both advantages diminished, the empire lacked alternative sources of strength. But there's a more hopeful lesson embedded in this story. Musa proved that African civilizations were capable of achievements that rivaled anything produced by European or Asian societies. His empire demonstrated sophisticated administrative systems, architectural innovations, educational achievements, and diplomatic capabilities that challenge any narrative about African inferiority or European exceptionalism. 700 years after Mansa Musa's death, his story continues raising questions that we struggle to answer. How do we balance economic development with environmental sustainability? How do nations maintain cultural authenticity while participating in global systems? How do we distribute wealth in ways that create prosperity without destroying social cohesion? What would have happened if Mali had developed differently? If Musa had chosen sustainability over expansion, cultural preservation over international recognition, institutional development over personal magnificence? Would African history have unfolded differently if Mali had remained strong enough to resist European colonization? These aren't just historical curiosities. They're questions that contemporary African nations continue grappling with as they balance traditional values with global integration, economic development with environmental protection, and national sovereignty with international cooperation. Mansa Musa was neither a perfect hero nor a simple villain. He was a brilliant leader who achieved unprecedented success while creating the conditions for his empire's eventual collapse. He was a generous ruler who shared his wealth widely while maintaining systems of exploitation and control. He was a visionary who connected Africa to global networks while inadvertently contributing to Africa's later exploitation. But perhaps that complexity is precisely what makes his story so compelling and instructive. Real historical figures aren't fairy tale characters. They're complicated people making difficult decisions under impossible circumstances, achieving remarkable things while making terrible mistakes, creating legacies that inspire and horrify in equal measure. What's undeniable is that for a brief, shining moment in the 14th century, a West African emperor controlled more wealth than anyone else on Earth, commanded respect from kingdoms across 3 continents, and proved that African civilizations could achieve anything that human societies were capable of achieving. The fact that we're still talking about Mansa Musa 7 centuries later, still trying to understand how he accumulated such incredible wealth and why his empire ultimately failed, suggests that his story contains truths about power, prosperity, and human nature that transcend his particular time and place. So what's your take on Mansa Musa's legacy? Was he a visionary leader whose achievements outweigh his failures? Or a cautionary tale about the dangers of unsustainable prosperity? How might history have been different if Mali had developed alternative sources of strength beyond gold production and personal charisma? And here's the question that might matter most. What can contemporary leaders learn from both Musa's spectacular successes and his empire's eventual collapse about building societies that are both prosperous and sustainable? If this incredible story of the world's richest man amazes you as much as it amazes us, subscribe to see more hidden histories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past. Because the world is full of stories like Mansa Musa's, tales of remarkable people achieving impossible things in places that history books forgot to mention. What other lost civilizations do you think might have shaped our world in ways we're only beginning to understand?